Welcome to Chapter 12. In this section, I will be talking about how we regulate our body temperature. As humans, we need to regulate our body temperature so it remains nearly constant at 37 degrees Celsius. So when our body temperature becomes hotter than this, our thermoregulatory function is going to be able to cool us down. Likewise, if our body temperature dips below 37 degrees Celsius, our body will help to try and increase the amount of heat being produced in our body to increase our body temperature. So fluctuations in our body temperature should not be greater than 1 degree Celsius or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. There are exceptions to this, and this is in times of fever or extreme conditions where our body temperature will fluctuate um, a greater range than normal. So for example, if we're sick and we have a fever, the new set point of our internal body temperature would be increased from 37 degrees Celsius to say 37.5 degrees Celsius. And this would allow our body to stay at a new homeostasis, allowing increased immune responses to work at this higher temperature in our body. The only way as humans we dissipate heat is to move heat from the core to our skin. And the way we do this is going to be through 4 different mechanisms. So the first two are conduction and convection. Conduction is the actual molecular contact of you with an object to transfer heat. So for example, if you wrap your hands around a warm mug on a cold day, you are gaining heat from that mug through conduction. Or if you go to the beach and you submerge yourself underwater to cool, the water that is in contact with your skin is cooler than your body temperature, resulting in heat dissipation from the body. Convection is similar, but this talks about the motion of the gas or liquid across that surface. So for example, if you are hot, you might stand in front of a fan and there would be a convective heat dissipation from your skin through the movement of air moving across your skin. Radiation is defined as the heat that's given off or accepted as infrared rays. So to gain heat through radiation, this comes from the sun. So this is why if you're running outside on a sunny day with little cloud coverage, you should be dressed in light colored clothing and not dark colored clothing, which would minimize the amount of heat gain through the sun. We also can gain heat through radiation that bounces off asphalt or the ground and reflects it back onto us. So if you have a option of running over grass or over asphalt on a sunny day, you would probably be better off running over grass because you would gain less heat through radiation. Also, if you've noticed, if you've ever gone to the Korean fair down in Kaka'ako that's held in that ward area, that area is surrounded by a lot of buildings with mirrored exterior walls. And when you get to a certain point, the ambient temperature is a lot hotter than where you had parked originally. And the reason being is that the sun is bouncing off its radiation off those mirrored exterior walls, and it's causing you to gain additional heat through radiation. Evaporation is a primary avenue for heat dissipation during exercise. And unlike the other modes of heat transfer, evaporation only goes one way, where evaporation only helps us to lose heat. We cannot gain heat through evaporation. So basically what evaporation is sweat, and then as the sweat evaporates or dries from our skin, it provides a cooling mechanism. And this is our primary way of heat dissipation during exercise. So evaporation accounts for 80% of total heat loss during exercise. So this is why on very, very humid days and you're exercising outside, the exercise itself seems relatively harder than if you were to exercise in an air-conditioned gym. Because instead of the evaporation happening where the sweat would be evaporated from the skin and the sweat may be rolling off your skin, this means that evaporation is not occurring. The evaporation of the sweat off the skin is not occurring, and this is our main way to dissipate heat during exercise. So at rest, radiation and convection are our primary methods for heat dissipation, and during exercise, evaporation is our main avenue for heat dissipation. And again, evaporation only goes in one way, where it helps to remove heat, whereas radiation, conduction, and convection work in both directions, where it can remove heat and then add heat to the body. So we have sensory thermal receptors in the skin, and the CNS then is going to be able to detect changes in the temperature, and this happens at our hypothalamus. So specifically, the preoptic anterior hypothalamus and the cerebral cortex will receive this afferent signal or sensory information. So the skin temperature changes occur before core temp, and this means that this allows for behavioral changes to happen before physiological changes. So for example, if you walk outside from an air-conditioned room out into a very hot and humid day, your skin temperature will sense the heat. So your behavioral adaptation would be to remove your jacket first. And this happens before the onset of sweating, which would be your physiological response to heat gain. So the cerebral cortex, I'm looking at this last bullet point, allows for the conscious perception of temperature and then a voluntary control of how you will adapt to increasing heat load or a cold environment. So what happens when we become hot? Well, the preoptic anterior hypothalamus will send a signal through the sympathetic nervous system to the smooth muscles in the walls of the arterioles to cause vasodilation. So if we look at number one, increased temperature is going to happen, and this is going to send a signal to our preoptic anterior hypothalamus, which will then cause our skin arterioles to vasodilate, and this is going to help move our blood from the core to our skin to help dissipate heat across our skin. Also, we might begin to sweat, and it's shown in number 4, where our sweat glands become active, and hopefully our sweat would be able to evaporate off our skin, and this would help us to cool even more. On the other hand, in times of cold, when our body temperature drops below our set point of 37 degrees Celsius, this signal also goes to our preoptic anterior hypothalamus, and this causes vasoconstriction. So the hypothalamus would signal to cause vasoconstriction in our arterioles to shunt blood from the skin, to try and keep the blood within our core so we won't lose unnecessary heat through our periphery. And we see this when we enter environments of cold, where our hands and feet are very white, which shows us that we don't have a lot of blood flow happening. And so the anastomoses in our hands and our feet of our glabrous skin or non-hairy skin, so the soles of your feet and the palms of your hand, they have these anastomoses that allow for very precise control and very effective control of blood flow. And that's why if you look at your hands in different environmental conditions, it can go from being white to very bright flush red, and that's because the arterioles are controlling where the blood is going to be redirected to. So in times of cold, we're going to shunt blood away from our skin, keep that blood within our core, and our hands will become white and it'll look white in appearance. If that is not enough to keep our body heat within our core, our metabolism will increase, and this is regulated by T4 or thyroxine, and also T3 as well, triiodothyronine. And the epinephrine and norepinephrine hormones will also enhance metabolic rate. Another way we increase body temperature is through shivering, which is shown in number 4. So shivering is a way that we increase our heat generation. It increases our metabolism, and it's an involuntary cycle of contraction and relaxation of muscle. And shivering is a complete waste of energy. And shivering only uses glucose as its primary fuel source. So if you are taking athletes out to compete, or if you're going to go out to compete in a cold environment, you want to make sure that when you're competing or when you're preparing to compete, that shivering is not taking place, because 1, it's going to deplete your glycogen, and 2, it's going to divert energy away from your activity itself. So we know that cardiovascular drift is when heart rate starts to creep up over a long endurance event due to dehydration. And it can be due to the fact that we're very hot and blood is being redirected to our skin. And as a result, venous return drops, causing a reduction in stroke volume, which results in this increase in heart rate or cardiovascular drift. There's another theory out there called the hot brain, which states that regardless at the rate at which our core temperature increases, the brain will signal to stop exercise when a critical brain temperature is reached. So there's different theories of what is regulating fatigue due to, or exercise termination due to heat gain. So we have 2 different types of sweat glands, one being eccrine sweat glands and the other one being apocrine, which is our nervous perspiration sweat gland. Eccrine sweat glands are the sweat glands that are responsible for secreting sweat to allow us to evaporate and cool. Apocrine glands do not contribute a lot to heat loss through evaporation. So in these eccrine sweat glands, we have a coil here that you see is being stimulated or controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. And then you also see that there's a duct before the sweat reaches the surface of the skin. So the sweat formed in the secretory part of the sweat gland has the same electrolyte composition as blood. So you can imagine if we were to sweat a lot, we would be losing a lot of electrolytes in the same composition as it exists in blood. But one of the benefits of heat acclimation or heat acclimatization is that we're able to sweat more dilute sweat. So as the sweat is sweated out through the duct, absorption of sodium and chloride is going to be able to happen through this duct portion. So also realize that the sweat rate, the rate at which the sweat is leaving through the duct, is going to dictate or regulate how much can be reabsorbed, how much sodium can be reabsorbed, because the faster the sweat rate, the less time that the duct has to absorb the sodium. So this sweat gland is going to be regulated by the sympathetic nerve. So you can see how the sweat gland is connected to efferent signaling from the CNS. Because if the CNS is signaling sympathetic nervous system stimulation, it will stimulate sweat gland activity. So we can increase our sweat by increasing our onset of sweating, so we can start sweating sooner. We can increase the number of sweat glands activated and increase the amount of sweat produced by each sweat gland. So maximal recruitment can be achieved in little as 8 minutes. The more heat acclimated you are, the earlier onset of sweating occurs, and the more dilute sweat you will also sweat. So I put this slide up here because I wanted to point out that our sweat rate can exceed the rate that we're able to absorb fluids that we ingest to replenish or to hydrate. So our sweat rate, depending on who we are and how acclimated we are to heat, can range from 0.8 all the way up to greater than 3 liters per hour. The maximum rate of stomach emptying is 0.8 to 1.2 liters per hour. So you can see that depending on the activity that we're doing, we would not possibly be able to replenish the fluids at the rate that we're losing them, which makes it easy for athletes in endurance events exercising in the heat to become dehydrated easily, especially if the subject or the athlete is hydrating with a sport drink with higher osmolality. Remember, we said that a sport drink should not have more than 6% carbohydrates contained within it. So if they're ingesting something with carbohydrates to replenish their glucose, this will also slow the rate of stomach emptying, so they would be at a higher risk of not hydrating fully. I also want to point out that our hormones, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, and aldosterone, are helping us through this process. So vasopressin, or ADH, remember, it's released from the posterior pituitary gland, and it contributes to water conservation at the kidneys. Aldosterone, remember, its main function was to reabsorb sodium at the kidneys. Aldosterone also acts on our sweat glands. So aldosterone will help to reabsorb sodium at the sweat gland. So aldosterone acts both at the kidney and at our eccrine sweat glands, which is pretty cool. So I want to reiterate the difference between dehydration and hypohydration. Dehydration means that you went out and you exercised and you sweat a lot. So you sweat a lot of water out, and you also rehydrated with water, but maybe not sodium. So dehydration is when plasma osmolality increase. Hypohydration is when we lose total body fluid, or we lose water, but we lose it, but its loss does not affect our plasma osmolality. So I used this example before. So dehydration is like taking a pot of water with salt, put salt in it, and letting that water boil. As it boils, water is evaporating out, but the amount of sodium remains the same in the pot. But since we've lost water, we have a relative increase in osmolality. Hypohydration is if we take that same pot of salted water and we ladle out, so we remove a homogeneous amount of water that contains the same amount of sodium. This means that our blood volume has reduced, but the amount of salt or osmolality in that pot of water has not changed. So be sure to know the difference between dehydration and hypohydration, where dehydration happens with exercise and hypohydration happens when we have fluid body shifts, so bed rest, when our venous return increases and our atria detects an increased pressure, which causes it to release ANP, or atrial natriuretic peptide, which which then stimulates diuresis. So this process happens when we undergo bed rest when we're sick, and also astronauts in microgravity um, are affected by this. Hydromyesis is sweat gland fatigue, and it's when we have sweat for a long time, for greater than 2 hours, and basically the epidermal cells around the sweat glands become swollen and they cause the pores to close, and so therefore we stop sweating. Anhidrosis is a complete inability to sweat. So if you're working with a patient or client who has anhidrosis and you realize that evaporation is a main avenue of heat dissipation during exercise, you will probably come to the conclusion that you must exercise indoors where it's cool, where your client would not have a great amount of heat body storage. So this figure is from your book, and it shows that in untrained men and women, their sweat composition of sodium chloride is higher. So with acclimation or with training, they sweat more dilute sweat. So in trained men, their sodium chloride concentration is about 1/3 to 1/2 compared to untrained men. For trained women, they conserve about 1/2 or 50% of the sodium when compared to untrained women. So this is how we become better sweaters, where we're able to sweat more dilute sweat. So notice that potassium, calcium, and magnesium are not reabsorbed by the sweat glands, and therefore the sweat composition is going to be similar between plasma and sweat. So how do we check for signs of dehydration? One, we can measure urine output. I think the general rule is you must go to the restroom at a minimum 4 to 5 times a day. If your urine output is less than 1 liter per day, that's a sure sign of dehydration. Specific gravity is when we would take a urine sample and use a transfer pipette and put it on this refractometer. So you would put the urine sample on this side, and there's this plastic cover slip that you would lift up and then put the urine sample on and then close that cover slip very gently so that urine doesn't splash. And then you would look into this eyepiece and hold it up to light. And when you do that, what you would see is a scale. And wherever this line appears, so it appears a colored and then a clear line, and this looks like it would be 1.0 between 0.3 and 0.4. So I'm looking between 0.3 and 0.4. So anything that is greater than a specific gravity of 1.03 would be deemed dehydrated. So if you see this line here, it says 30. So if it looks like this sample would state that this individual is dehydrated. So if you see this number 30, anything greater or above this would signal dehydration. Anything a line lower than here would indicate that the individual is hydrated. There's also a urine color chart that is easy to use. You would have to transfer the urine sample into a clear test tube, hold it up to light, and then compare it to the urine color chart. Anything greater than a color of 6 would be deemed as dehydrated. The ACSM statement or guidelines state that an athlete should drink 500 mLs of fluid 2 hours prior to exercise. You want to drink during exercise, drink early, and then drink to maintain your body weight. Remember, a 2% loss of body weight due to dehydration will impair your performance and endurance activity. You want to make sure the fluid is cool because it's going to be more palatable. Water is the best choice with a few options, with the exception being exercise lasting longer than 1 hour. In that case, you would probably want to replenish with um, sodium and carbohydrates. And this is where your Gatorade and your sports drinks come into play. The heat index has been traditionally been used to determine the environmental conditions for athletes. The heat index takes into account air temperature and relative humidity. A better way to determine environmental conditions is something called WBGT, which stands for wet bulb globe temperature, because it accounts for conduction, convection, evaporation, and radiation. So how do we do this? The wet bulb globe temperature is comprised of 3 different temperatures. One being a dry bulb temperature, which would be if you had a thermometer and you held it at the event location, whatever that thermometer read would be your dry bulb. Your wet bulb would be a measure of humidity, the evaporative capacity in that environment. And the way you would determine this is using something called a sling psychrometer. This is a sling psychrometer down here. And what it is a thermometer with some sort of gauze that we can wet at the end. And it's held on a handle which can be spun around. So you would wet the gauze with deionized water, hold the handle, and sling it around and swing it around until this temperature on the thermometer stops dropping. The more dry the condition, the temperature would drop more. The more humid the condition, the temperature would change to a smaller degree. And this is important because this is measuring our evaporative capacity, right? So if it's very humid, our ability to rely on evaporation as a body cooling mechanism is going to be limited. And that is why this temperature is rated at 70% of the entire equation. Your globe temperature takes into account radiation. So radiation from the sun. So if you're performing exercise in the gym or indoors, your globe temperature and your dry bulb temperature would be the same. If you're exercising or performing out under in the daytime, your globe temperature would be the temperature that would be taken from a metal sphere with the thermometer stuck in the middle, and this sphere should be painted with a flat black paint. And this will measure the radiation that is being gained from the sun. So you guys know what I'm talking about. In the summertime, when you park out in the sun because you can't find parking in the shade, and then you get to your car and your thermometer in the car tells you it's like 95 degrees Fahrenheit. But the environmental condition for that day was reported on the news to be 82 degrees Fahrenheit. And that difference between 82 and 95 is due to the radiation from the sun. So the globe temperature, which is abbreviated with the T sub G, takes into account radiation. So according to this equation, this factor, the wet bulb temperature, or the temperature that reflects our evaporative cooling capacity, is the most heavily weighted. And then the next heavily weighted factor is the globe temperature, meaning radiation from the sun is going to highly impact our body heat gain and our ability to dissipate heat. So when we look back at the heat index, it doesn't take into account radiation, right? It only takes into account humidity and dry bulb temperature, or what are the ambient temperatures that day. So when you're planning an event, you want to take into account the WBGT, the wet bulb globe temperature, and realize that high humidity is going to limit the ability of the athletes to dissipate heat, and this is going to increase the risk of heat illness. Also, if you're exercising or competing on a very humid day with no clouds in sight and with no air velocity or movement of air or trade winds, this is going to drastically negatively affect your athlete's ability to dissipate heat and really increasing the risk of heat illness. So these are just guidelines for preventing hyperthermia. Basically, cancel events if the environmental load, heat load is going to be too much. Because remember, as athletes exercise, they're going to be generating metabolic heat as well. So they're going to be gaining heat from the environment, the sun. They're going to be generating heat from their exercising muscles. And if their evaporative cooling mechanism is going to be limited by the humidity, this is going to increase the risk of heat illness. So this brings us to the end of this section, and I will record the next section on heat illness. In this section, we're going to discuss acclimation or acclimatization to altitude. Remember, acclimation refers to the adaptations that are obtained in artificial conditions. Acclimatization refers to the adaptations that are attained in natural conditions. So acclimation and acclimatization results in pulmonary, cardiovascular, and skeletal muscle changes that improves performance. And this takes about 3 weeks at moderate altitude. So any increase in altitude above moderate altitude, you would have to add another additional week for every 600-meter of ascent that you are performing at. So the pulmonary adaptations that we see, of course, we have an increased ventilation at rest and during some maximal exercise. This is what we talked about in the previous section. Your resting ventilation rate is 40% higher than at sea level, and the submaximal rate is 50 times higher. Your erythropoietin levels will also increase as a result of the hypoxic conditions. So the erythropoietin release from the kidney will increase red blood cell production over the next few days, but it takes about 18 to 23 days to see measurable changes in hematocrit. And this is because the half-life of the red blood cell is about 28 days. So the increase in erythropoietin stimulates polycythemia, which is the increase in red blood cell count. And your red blood cell count will remain elevated for 3 months post-altitude exposure, even after return to sea level. So polycythemia is defined as a hematocrit greater than 60%. At sea level, normal hematocrit levels are about 45% to 50%. So a hematocrit level of 60% is a significant improvement or significant increase in hematocrit. Although our oxygen carrying capacity has increased, we also need to remember that an increase in red blood cell count or polycythemia increases the viscosity of the blood flow, or increases the viscosity of the blood and decreases blood flow. Our plasma volume, as we discussed earlier, drops off as soon as we ascend to altitude. Over time, plasma volume slowly increases, and then this plasma volume increase supports an increased stroke volume and cardiac output. But remember that first initial drop in plasma volume is due to the release of ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, and also the insensible water loss through our respiratory tract due to hyperventilation in a dry climate. So there's a study that was performed that showed the effect of intermittent hypoxic conditioning on arterial oxygen saturation. So this was done on 9 males and 4 females, and O2 sat is measured with a pulse oximeter, and at sea level it is about 97 or 98%, and that is normal at sea level. So what this is showing is at different altitudes ranging from 2,700 meters to 6,400 meters, And these are simulated altitudes, which mean that the level of oxygen was reduced to match what would be available at these altitudes. So what this table is showing is that at these different altitudes, there is an apparent decrease in oxygen saturation, whereas normal O2 sat is 97 to 98%. So you can see as we move to altitude, O2 saturation drops. As we move down the table across the weeks, it looks like oxygen saturation starts to increase, right? 82 to 86 to 90, and so on and so forth. And this is due to the acclimation of the body to intermittent hypoxia, meaning the body is responding to these hypoxic conditions by increasing red blood cell production through erythropoietin, which is increasing our oxygen carrying capacity. So athletes and coaches have been playing with living high, living low, training high, living low, different combinations of this to try and maximize the amount of erythropoietin and red blood cell production. So one of the best ways to improve performance is to have your athlete train low and sleep high. So this means that they would be able to train low at sea level, perform their maximal exertion, do their training at maximal intensity, and then at night sleep in a chamber with reduced oxygen content. So the reduced oxygen content would stimulate erythropoietin release, increase red blood cell count when they sleep. So instead of breathing 21% O2 at night, they would breathe 15% of oxygen at night, and this would and this hypoxic condition would stimulate erythropoietin. So this graph is showing the hemoglobin concentration of individuals who live at sea level versus altitude. And it shows that at altitude, hemoglobin levels of individuals who reside at altitude are the highest. And as altitude comes back down to sea level, hemoglobin concentrations are reduced. Remember, normal hemoglobin concentrations are about 14 to 15 grams per deciliter. So as we move and we start to reside at altitude, the body compensates and adapts by increasing the hemoglobin concentration. And this is related to erythropoietin. At altitude, we also have a decrease in muscle function and a decrease in cross-sectional area of the muscle. The main reason being we have a negative protein balance. One, we might be sick, we might have acute mountain sickness, so we're going to be dehydrated. Our caloric intake will be reduced, but we also have an increased basal metabolic rate. So as a result, we will lose muscle mass. However, we increase our capillary density as a result of the hypoxic conditions. So remember we said that the body will adapt only when it's stressed beyond a certain point. Under hypoxic conditions, the body tries to adapt by developing new capillary beds, and according to Fick's law of diffusion, the greater the surface area, the greater the diffusion of that gas across the membrane. So the increased capillary density will help to increase the amount of gas diffusion across the membrane, specifically into the tissue. Our muscle metabolic function reduces, our mitochondrial function and glycolytic enzymes reduce, as well as our oxidative capacity. So there was a study that used runners that show there are no major cardiovascular adaptations after 2 months of altitude. Although they would be more tolerant to the hypoxic conditions, and they would have had the increased red blood cell count, the increased hematocrit and hemoglobin, there are no positive benefits on the heart itself. And this is probably due to the fact that at altitude, you're not able to train at the same intensity as you are at sea level. So the investigators did not find improvements in the left ventricular internal diameter, the left ventricular wall thickness, and so on. So many competitors and coaches try to find that combination of training, or try to find that training regimen that would give their athletes that extra edge. So there's a combination of things that have been tried to train high and then compete low, train high to gain those benefits and adaptations to altitude, and then compete high, and then train low and then compete high. So different variations have been studied. What we do know is that 3 weeks of acclimation or acclimatization are needed to receive the full adaptations. And this is at moderate altitude, so 2,000 to 3,000 meters. For each 600-meter ascent, another week of acclimation is required. And all of these effects are lost within a month of return to sea level. Sorry, I hope we can't hear the noise. Somebody's doing construction. Okay, so at altitude, there is hypoxia, hypoxic conditions, and this prevents high intensity aerobic training. So when you train at altitude, your ability to perform at the highest maximal capacity is hindered, and this will have a detraining effect on your athletes. Also, living and training high is going to lead to dehydration, a low blood volume, a low venous return, a low stroke volume, and that negative nitrogen balance will also lead to low muscle mass or a loss of muscle mass. So many have asked, what is the value of living high but training low? So the training low portion allows the athlete to train at maximal intensity. So if you were to ask an exercise physiologist, what would be the timeline for competing at altitude? Should I take my team up right before the event, or should I take them up 2 to 3 weeks prior and let them acclimatize? Most will say to compete as soon as possible after arriving at altitude. Although you do not confer the benefits of acclimatization, the likelihood of your athlete succumbing to acute mountain sickness will be small. The most severe symptoms of acute mountain sickness occur at 2 to 3 days post altitude exposure. So you want to compete as soon as possible after arriving at altitude so that your athletes do not succumb to acute mountain sickness. Acute mountain sickness is one of the illnesses of altitude, and we'll talk about this in the next section. Training high for 2 weeks before competing will allow the athlete to overcome the most severe symptoms of acute mountain sickness. But again, they're going to have to be working their way up from possibly, most likely, being dehydrated from being sick, working back up from a negative nitrogen or protein balance because of the reduced drive to consume food, the increased basal metabolic rate, and they need to try and build their plasma volume back up to the same level it was at sea level. So aerobic training at altitude is not going to be as effective because the subject will not be able to push themselves to the same extent at altitude versus sea level. So if you train high and live low, you'll get the best of both worlds, meaning you can train at sea level at maximal exertion, but at night, maybe sleep in an artificial chamber that provides hypoxic conditions. So you would reap the benefits of low oxygen partial pressures in the air. There was a study that tested athletes on a 5K run, and they showed that living high and training low had significant improvements on their 5K run time trial. So living high and training low has been validated, where athletes would live at 2,500 meters and then train at a lower altitude. Their aerobic performance improved by 1% and their VO2 max improved by 3%. And when you're in the elite athlete status, this 1 to 3% improvement is huge, and it's a significant improvement in endurance performance. So this graph is showing the effects of living high and training low on aerobic performance. And the way to read this is any dot or any data point above this blue line indicates an improvement in race time. So for example, in this individual, he had a 4% improvement in race time. Anything below this blue line indicates a decrement in performance time. So for example, for this data point, this indicates that this female collegiate athlete had a 2% decrement in race time. So on the whole, it suggests that most athletes will benefit from living high and training low, and there'll be a handful of athletes who will have the opposite response. So it's this living high and training low will be specific to your athlete and would need to be determined based upon how they respond to this type of training regimen. So artificial altitude training is effective in the sense that if you breathe hypoxic air 1 to 2 hours a day and train um, normally, that previous study that I showed that the oxygen saturation improved. However, there's contradicting or controversy around this concept, where artificial altitude training in some studies have shown no improvements in exercise performance. So a lot of it has to do on the responsiveness of the athlete to this type of training. So just remember that training high will stimulate the altitude acclimation. So you'd reap the benefits, but training high also does not allow your athlete to train as hard. So you'll lose some of the physical conditioning. Sleeping high and training low has not scientifically been validated yet, but as you can see based upon the data that we showed earlier, that the majority of endurance athletes would benefit from this type of training regimen. So living high in a natural condition and training low, some people believe is the best approach, especially for elite athletes. Non-elite athletes may benefit from artificial approaches. Again, it just will depend on your athlete's response to this training regimen. So this is the end of this section. In the previous sections, we talked about how we can assess body composition. In this section, we're going to talk about what are the normative percentage of body fat ranges and the impact of body fat on performance. So this table is taken from your textbook where it gives different percentages of body fat for males and females in different sports. So the lower cusp of percentage of body fat are reported for females in bodybuilding at 6%, in gymnastics at 8%, triathlon and rowing also at 8%. The lower cusp for males is 5%, and that's reported with bodybuilding, football, which is surprising, at 5 to 25%, skating, wrestling, and weightlifting also at 5%. So notice that these are normative ranges that are being reported for each sport. If you were to use these different body composition methods in the field, you'll also have to realize that each measurement that you derive or measure is going to have a plus and minus 1 to 2% body fat. So keep this in mind as you use these body composition methods in the field. So most athletes are focused on maximizing fat-free mass. So this is the skeletal muscle mass, which is going to be desirable for strength, power, and muscular endurance, and to minimize their relative body fat, which many coaches believe improves speed, endurance, balance, agility, and jumping ability. So this line of thought is taken from previous research that show that the lower the percentage of body fat of the athlete, the faster they're able to run, the further they'll be able to jump, and the greater number of sit-ups that they would be able to perform compared to somebody with a higher percentage of body fat. However, in this field, we'd rather be concerned with total body size or weight versus fat-free mass or fat mass, because there may be some athletes that may not benefit from a higher fat-free mass, and these are going to be the athletes that need to carry their weight in their event. So, for example, long distance runners, they're usually lanky. High jumpers and long jumpers, pole jumpers and pole vaulters need to carry their weight. So, having a higher fat free mass is going to result in having greater mass to carry over these distances. Also, weightlifters and sumo wrestlers may benefit from being fatter. And then also swimmers may benefit from having a little bit more fat since fat is buoyant, which will reduce the energy cost of staying on the surface. Yet in general, when we're talking about athletic performance, the leaner the athlete, typically the better they perform. However, we'd like to point out that the percentage of body fat and performance data can be misleading in the sense that some coaches believe that if a small weight loss improves performance, then major weight loss should improve it even more. And this becomes very dangerous when working with athletes who perform in a sport where aesthetics is also considered. So this includes things such as gymnastics, dance, swimming, diving. And this can lead to injury, especially in female athletes who have a percentage of body fat that's less than 6%. Other risks involved with severe weight loss include dehydration, chronic fatigue related to overtraining, disordered eating and eating disorders, menstrual dysfunction, and bone mineral disorders. So dehydration and electrolyte imbalances is a major risk associated with severe weight loss. So fasting and low-calorie diets lead to a large amount of weight loss, and this occurs primarily through dehydration. So if you've ever noticed after you eat a high carbohydrate meal, such as pasta, the next day you feel very rigid, you feel heavy. And the reason for this is because for every gram of carbohydrate stored, 2.6 grams of water are also stored with it. So carbohydrates is a very heavy fuel. So by not eating a lot of carbohydrates, the amount of water stored with it is going to be reduced. Also, losses as little as 2% of body weight will impair performance. So say for instance, you weigh 150 pounds. If we multiply that by 2%, that results in a 3-pound weight loss. So for example, if you are dehydrated and you've lost 3 pounds due to water weight alone, this is classified as 2% of dehydration, or dehydration where your body weight has been reduced by 2%, and this would impair your performance, your sport performance. Severe weight loss also leads to chronic fatigue, and this is related to the neural and hormonal components, and it appears that the sympathetic nervous system is inhibited and the parasympathetic system dominates. So you're in a constant state of stress, and the hypothalamus doesn't function normally, and the immune function is impaired. So your ability to recover after cold or illness is going to be compromised. This is the female athlete triad, and it's comprised of 3 separate dysfunctions, which when they combine together, we call them the female athlete triad. And they're comprised of irregular periods or amenorrhea, low bone density or osteoporosis, and then some sort of eating disorder, whether it be bulimia or anorexia. So athletes with the female athlete triad are going to be very vulnerable to medical problems related to low energy availability, um, and also electrolyte imbalances. And since we know that sodium, potassium, and calcium are very important in our cardiac function, this is also going to be related to dysfunction of the cardiovascular system. So the female athlete triad is something that needs to be monitored for, especially in athletes who perform in a sport where aesthetics is part of the sport, such as gymnastics, ballet, dance. And again, they are categorized by these three different dysfunctions. And that is the end of this section. In this section, we'll be talking about DEXA, or dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. DEXA uses low energy X-ray to determine body composition, and it measures total body bone mass, lean tissue mass, and fat mass. And it's usually used to assess a region of the body, because to scan the entire body would take a very long time. So it has really good precision in estimating bone mass density and soft tissue. Primarily in the field, DEXA is used to measure bone mass density, particularly in individuals with high risk of osteoporosis who are osteopenic. So the DEXA measures bone-free lean tissue mass, fat mass, soft tissue mass, fat-free mass, and percentage of body fat. When working with subjects who are going to have the DEXA performed, they should be advised to not take any calcium supplements. Like any method, the machine needs to be calibrated against a known calibration marker. For the underwater weighing, we used a weight. For the bod pod, they used that 50-liter cylinder. And in this case, they would use different markers with known um, amounts of absorptiometry. So what you're going to see in this DEXA section is that there's an X-ray source, and the X-ray source sends out an X-ray through the body, and then the body would absorb some of the X-ray, and whatever is not absorbed would be detected by a detector array. So to calibrate this machine, you would use markers with known absorption rates to ensure that what the DEXA is measuring is actually real. This takes about 5 to 30 minutes, depending on how big the region that is being scanned, and also whether a fan-based or pencil-based method is used. So this looks like a fan-based method where there's a fan of X-ray, which is going to take less time than a pencil-based DEXA, where it just be a line or a pencil beam that is going to be sent through the individual. This is going to be a lot more accurate, but it's going to increase the amount of time that it takes. So the principle of DEXA is that the density of tissue attenuates X-rays of high and low photon energies at different rates. So in other words, the denser the body part, there's going to be more absorption, and then less detection is going to be detected by the array detector at the top. DEXA also has a lot of assumptions, one being that the amount of fat over bone is going to be the same as the amount of fat over bone-free tissue. Also, it has the assumption that the anterior-posterior depth of the person's limb or body part that is going to be measured is no more than 20 centimeters. So if you're using the DEXA on the abdominal region, you need to make sure that the patient's anterior-posterior depth is no more than 20 centimeters or 7.8 inches. The hydration and electrolyte content of the lean body mass is constant. This is another assumption of the DEXA. So limitations to the DEXA, obviously for obese clients, you would only be able to do regional body comp methods over perhaps the arms or legs and not the trunk region. Children also have more water than bone in the fat-free mass compartment, or and also the elderly have differences in fluids, and if they are dehydrated, they would have less water in their fat-free mass compartment. And then this is what I was talking about earlier, where the fan-based X-ray beam instead of the pencil beam will cause inaccurate results, but it will be faster than the pencil beam. And this is just a short introduction to DEXA, and this concludes our section.